We're going to be hearing today from the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Bill Shorten. He's about to get underway.
Mr Shorten was elected to Parliament in 2007, and as a junior frontbencher in the Rudd government, he helped lay the groundwork for the creation of the NDIS. When he became Minister following last year's election victory for the Labor Party, he inherited a scheme that had expanded to become one of the fastest growing areas of government expenditure. Today, Mr Shorten will outline the steps he plans to take to ensure its financial footing for the hundreds of thousands of Australians relying on its services is put in place. You can follow the conversation on Twitter @PressClubAust or #MPC. Please everyone welcome Bill Shorten to the stage.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I appreciate the opportunity of the National Press Club to give an address on the future of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's actually 14 years to the month when I stood here as the Parliamentary Secretary for Disabilities to talk about how every Australian with a disability deserved a right to an ordinary life. Now, the club's changed its menu a few times since then. We're all a bit older and hopefully a little bit wiser. I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of the Canberra region, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders present today. I also want to acknowledge the 1 in 5 Australians living with a disability and their families today. I've had no greater privilege in my 15 years in politics than to listen to, learn from and work with so many great Australians from the mighty disability movement. They're great Australians, humble people who've campaigned for decades. We've got Chairman Kurt Fernley here, Doogie Hurd, Rhonda Galbally, Kevin Cox, Graham Innes, Marianne Diamond, Leah Van Poppel, Meredith Allen, there's Craig Wallace, Kirsten Dean, Bruce Bonady and many more. There's great people I've met who we've lost. Leslie Hall, Sue Salthouse and Stella Young. I have stood on the shoulder of these fierce warriors and the millions of Australians that they represent. If you are an Australian living with a disability, a family member of a person with disability or a carer, I want to say something to you right now. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is here to stay. It is not going away. But, and this is important, we do need to get it back on track. It's not a financial imperative, it's core to improving outcomes and improving lives. Correcting course will not be easy. It'll take time and require the sort of collective effort that you Australians with disability showed during the campaign to establish the NDIS in the very first place. But, and this is important too, I will work with and for you every step along the way. I want to brief you and the nation on the work that must be done to secure the future of the NDIS. I want to explain why we created the NDIS, explain how the NDIS has lost its way, and explain why we need to reboot the scheme and disability services and supports. So not just the why, but the how. You could call this a sort of State of the Union address on the NDIS. Why we created the NDIS, this year when we talk about why we created it, marks a decade since the inception. The NDIS was and remains a bold initiative. Big, complex, life-changing economic and social policy. But it's driven by a basic human question that has fueled my own political journey, the itch that I have under my skin that I've always had to scratch. How in the lucky country can we tolerate any Australian being treated as a second-class citizen? I had the privilege to be appointed Parliamentary Secretary for Disabilities by Prime Minister Rudd at the end of 2007. Before then, I thought across 2 decades of working as a trade unionist, I thought that I knew disadvantage and discrimination. I thought I knew powerlessness and poverty. I thought I knew my country, but I didn't. Great advocates like Leslie and Rhonda and Stella showed me an invisible Australia. An Australia that shut out its fellow citizens from education, employment, housing, you name it. An Australia where an Indigenous person with a disability faced a double disadvantage. It was an Australia that was unfair, propped up by a support system that was inefficient and unsustainable. I met too many people with disabilities who suffered isolation and disadvantage because others could not see beyond their impairment. I heard too many ageing parents speak of their midnight anxiety of who would love their precious adult child with a disability when they no longer could. Siblings too, who shared these same fears. I saw people who had accidents go from an ordinary life to subclass citizen in a split second, not because of their impairment, but because of the system that was failing them. I saw families and carers who willingly put their life on hold to care and love for their person with a disability, but were tired, physically, financially, emotionally exhausted. In 2007, and this is a fact some have conveniently forgotten, Australian state and federal governments in general, and disability services in particular, were on a course for a socio-economic catastrophe. The country is paying more and more for worse and worse outcomes for people with disability. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, go back and read the 2009 Shutout report on the experiences of people with disability, or the 2011 Productivity Commission report into disability care. Labor created the NDIS. We thought it would save people with disability and those without from the catastrophe that we could see coming. And here's the thing, we were right. The NDIS has changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Australians with disability and their families. People like Avi, a 6-year-old from Darwin who loves playing wheelchair basketball and being with her friends, but happens to have a rare genetic neuromuscular disorder. The support she's received through the NDIS make Avi stronger and more independent. Not only that, that assistance has enabled her mum, Bethan, a former ballet dancer, to open her own baby ballet school. 11-year-old Ace, he'll tell anyone who's listening, he's a great swimmer, he's a pro at riding a horse. But Ace was born non-verbal and needs assistance with everyday activities. He now has a communication device and a speech therapist. He can speak for himself with the aid of technology. And the NDIS is a lifeline for people like Greg and Kevin. Kevin is a 47-year-old First Nations man. His passions are arts, crafts and woodwork. He also has an intellectual disability and requires 24-hour care. When he lost his mum, Sally, Kevin's dad, Greg, took over sole responsibility for his care. Thanks to the NDIS, Kevin's learning to garden and cook and further develop his social skills. NDIS participants like Kevin and Avi and Ace were shut out of the mainstream back in 2007. Theirs is but literally some of hundreds of thousands of lives, and the NDIS has also saved a disability system from collapse. The truth is that the NDIS is the difference between a life and a living death for many vulnerable Australians. And as a nation, every state and territory and every community has directly benefited economically and socially from the NDIS. Australians overwhelmingly support our scheme. Australians witness the difference it makes to families, communities and nation. Remember, 1 in 5 Australians reports as having a disability. None of us are immune. We're all touched by it. Every one of you today knows someone with a disability. Think of them and then tell me that the NDIS isn't a great idea. Australians know the NDIS is as fundamental to our social democracy as Medicare and universal superannuation, fair pay and the pension. It's built upon the great good Australian idea of the fair go. The NDIS is something that we all in Australia can be proud of. But a decade of mismanagement means it's in trouble. Fraud and inefficiencies have led to a narrative where cost overrides the reality of return on investment. As NDIS reported last year, for every dollar invested in the NDIS, it's delivering a $2.25 return to the economy. If only all government interventions or private businesses could boast this outcome. Now, one of the measures of a great reform, I put to you, is that it outlives the government. The NDIS outlived the Rudd-Gillard governments and the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison governments. Testament to the strength of reform, testament to the strength of community support. But there is a difference, isn't there, between surviving and thriving. During the last 9 years, the NDIS has been undermined by constant attack from a revolving door of disgraced coalition ministers. The coalition record of malign neglect is appalling. They muzzled the National Disability Insurance Agency. They wouldn't even let the NDIA choose its own IT system or hire enough people to answer the phones and run the scheme. The board was stacked with political confederates. They tried to bulldoze through reform, which they called independent assessments. But that was just Orwellian doublespeak for Robodebt 2.0. They let down people with disability by leaving the NDIS wide open to fraud. It's one of my greatest regrets is that the NDIS has been at the mercy of administrative vandals for 90% of its existence. The fact that it survived, though, is credit to the dedication of people with disabilities, their families, their advocates, their allies, the service providers, unions, and the never-to-be underestimated decency of the Australian people. But the NDIS is not what it should be. It is not delivering the outcomes Australians with disabilities need and the Australian public expects. For the NDIS to reach its potential, it needs a reboot. My colleagues and I are strongly committed to deliver on the how, not just the why. Let me explain what I mean. In the days and weeks and months since we were elected, this government has worked to deliver on our promises. For me, that's working every day to get the NDIS back on track. I know every day counts in the lives of people with disabilities and their families. Last October, I appointed an expert panel to conduct an independent review of the NDIS. That panel, co-chaired by Bruce Bonahady and Lisa Paul, is consulting widely to report back to me by October. It's reporting on the design, the operation, sustainability of the scheme, and how we build a more responsive, supportive and sustainable market and workforce. But that doesn't mean that we're sitting on our hands waiting till the final report. I believe the first and best way to safeguard the integrity of the NDIS is to put people with lived experience in leadership roles. And that's why, even though he's a greatly humble man, I managed to convince disability advocate Kurt Fernley to become chair of the NDIA board. He still hasn't forgiven me. We are genuinely lucky to have a leader of Kurt's calibre. We're proud that also people with disability are now half the directorship of the NDIA board. Now, under the coalition, the efforts of hard-working staff were smothered by what I call a clay layer of management that stubbornly resisted progress. Since becoming minister, the value of the grassroots NDIS staff has stood out to me. These good people deserve the kudos for the work they do, as well as for sustaining their vocation for working in disability under the previous administration. There's been a culture shift breathing new life into the National Disability Insurance Agency. I want to acknowledge the contribution of our new CEO, Rebecca Forkingham, and the refreshed executive of the NDIA. But we also said that we'd crack down on fraud, and we're doing that. Last October, we created a fraud fusion task force. It's now got 38 investigations underway, involving more than $300 million in payments. Unethical actors and criminal syndicates have taken advantage of the poor administration. Tip-offs are increasing now. The volume's almost double what it was this time last year. 1,300 in January, 1,600 in February, 1,700 in March. I can't go into detail about the investigations, but it's personally infuriating that some Australians think that they should be allowed to steal from people with disability. Every dollar of NDIS funding must go to the people for whom the scheme was designed, full stop. Now, there's another area that we couldn't wait until October to act upon, which was the warehousing of NDIS participants in the hospitals of Australia. In 2021, a Victorian government analysis found that on average, it took 160 days to discharge NDIS participants after they were medically ready to leave hospital. Imagine that. You're ready to go home, but you've got to spend almost a half a year waiting, while there are other people languishing on hospital waiting lists. This situation makes no sense. It's not just an immense waste of resources, but it's a return to a Keynesian reality that the NDIS was designed to end, an insidious violation of human rights. Our government's put people and supports in place to slash the bed block in hospital discharges. We've already reduced delays from 160 days to 29 days. It's saving, according to the AMA, up to $550 million for hospital costs. We're tackling another inherited problem too, the 400% increase in appeals to the AAT. These appeals force participants to undergo months and years of exhausting litigation. I'm pleased to tell you that 70% of the legacy cases parked in the courts at the time of the election are now resolved. So in summary, we've been busy, but as important as the changes are, they're nowhere near enough to deliver the outcomes that will change the lives of more Australians with disability and secure the sustainability of the scheme. We need to deliver systemic reform. And let me be clear, I mean systemic reform of the whole disability support ecosystem, the NDIS, mainstream and community services. When I talk about rebooting disability services, that's what I'm talking about, systemic reform. Let me quickly detail the fundamental systemic flaw identified to me by participants. The system is too rigid. It throws up Kafkaesque barriers to access. It lacks empathy. It gouges on prices. It's way too complex, and it's traumatising for people to deal with. People with disability have often felt caught between some predatory providers and a historically impersonal government agency. We've got to improve the participant experience. If we improve participant experience, if we make people's lives easier rather than harder to deal with the NDIS, we will reduce waste, inefficiency and inflationary costs. Now, to the journalists in the room, this isn't a budget dump. I'm not about to steal the Treasurer's thunder. But what I am doing, there they go, what I am doing is outlining the 6 policy directions that we'll work on to deliver better outcome for people with disability. In the process, help secure the ongoing future of the scheme. This approach, of course, has been discussed with the board, the NDI leadership and the review leadership. Our first systemic reform is to increase the NDI workforce and its specialisation. To improve the participant experience, we must focus on the people they deal with in the agency and the people who support them in the community. That means lifting staff caps, returning some call centre functions in-house, getting the culture right so we can reduce the staff churn. Points emphasised by the Joint Standing Committee on the NDIS in its interim report, and it's great that the chairwoman, Libby Coker, is here today. The bottom line is that to improve outcomes, we need to nurture a better relationship between the staff of the scheme and participants. We need to have the capability and specialisation to proactively intervene to fill service gaps in areas like Indigenous communities, regional and remote and rural Australia. We've got to update our system so that people with disability only have to tell us their story once. Investing in better resources and better systems will also avoid cases where people in the same family with the same or similar disabilities receive completely different funding plans. Ultimately, greater investment in NDI capability equates to participants being treated with understanding and humanity. Our second systemic reform is to move to long-term planning. Short-term planning just isn't working. It's stressful, debilitating, frustrating, nonsensical that every 12 months or 6 months, participants and their families have to prove that they're still disabled. Amputees must still prove they're missing a limb. But the people who are blind have got to prove they still can't see. The people who have Down syndrome, they still have Down syndrome. Instead of causing grief and wasting resources, let's think long term. Why not have multi-year plans, more flexible and sustainable, freeing up time to produce better plans that deliver better outcomes to people with disability, ridding us of the perverse incentive that the only thing that matters in the NDIS is the plan, getting it, keeping it and renewing it. And this will deliver more predictability for all involved. Longer-term plans can't be set and forget, though, I understand. They need to be able to adapt to participants' changes. The needs of a person with Huntington's, for example, does change over time. But the principle of long-term is better than short-term stands. My third systemic reform is the need to address spiralling costs. Reasonable and necessary supports lie at the heart of the NDIS. It is a bounded concept. Supports must be reasonable and necessary. I also just said that I want to maximise the benefit of every NDIS dollar we spend. I want to be clear. I'm talking about maximising the benefits for the participants, no one else. There are some providers who do overcharge for goods and services. There is, unfortunately, a cultural assumption in Australia that where there's government money, you can charge more. Because an NDIS package is taxpayer funded, it is not fair game for the doubling and tripling of prices. It shouldn't be treated as some sort of wedding tax. And remember, if one provider is overcharging for their service, it means a participant cannot afford another service they might need. I expect the independent panel to provide recommendations on ways to maximise participant outcomes for every dollar spent. Participants are valued clients, not human ATMs. We can trial such things as blended payments to achieve incentives to look at outcomes rather than being dependent on the volume of supports. We must also return to the underlying goal of any intervention. The underlying goal of any intervention is to reduce the need for support over time and increase participants' independence in their daily living. The parent of any child on the NDIS will tell you that they hope that their child can exit the scheme as soon as possible. I'm pleased to announce today the NDI will fund a pilot program in partnership with the Telethon Kids Institute in Western Australia that will examine whether preemptive intervention for children showing early behavioural signs of autism may reduce the level of support required later in life. Some 700 families in Western Australia will be invited to be part of the pilot, and if that shows that intervening earlier can assist children to have improved outcomes as they develop, I think it's very exciting for future generations and for early intervention mainstream services outside the NDIS, so the NDIS is not the only lifeboat in the ocean. Our fourth systemic reform is to review supported independent living, or SIL. Supported independent living is designed to allow people with higher needs to live in their home, but with significant amount of help, 24/7 if necessary. Currently, the program is delivering poor outcomes for too many participants. In some cases, SIL splits up families or couples and drives people into institutional settings that can, in some cases, be inappropriate and absolutely not in the best interests of the participant in terms of safety, quality and outcomes. The NDIS review is already looking at ways to get better home and living decisions for participants. Integral to this is the housing supply, the rental market accessibility, co-tenancy models, the role of community housing, other innovative housing and accommodation models designed by people with disability and their families. Our fifth systemic reform must be to target the misuse of NDIS funds, to eliminate unethical practices, to go beyond tackling criminal syndicates, with a renewed focus on evidence and data. We can get rid of shoddy therapies that offer little or no value to participants or desperate parents. What I class as unethical practices includes pressuring participants to ask for services or support ratios they don't need, spending participants' money contrary to their plan, asking for or accepting additional fees for a service, and offering rewards for taking particular services not on a participant's plan. But let me stress at this point, there are so many great service providers, from the whole range of the big, long-standing not-for-profits to new family-run small businesses. But we must say to the untrustworthy providers who make participants feel dehumanised, who feel treated as cash cows, you're not welcome. You taint the reputations of quality service providers. Your old business models will change. We'll have more NDIS staff in place with the skills to ensure that providers deliver outcomes and don't overcharge. My sixth and final reform is fundamental. The NDIS needs to be surrounded by increased community and mainstream supports. When I say increased, it is more a case of mainstream services actually delivering on inclusion and universal service provision as they've always been meant to do. I hear from many individuals and families that a form of unintentional division seems to have crept in, where if you have a disability, you take the NDIS line and you don't take the mainstream line. And once you're on NDIS, everything becomes an NDIS issue. People's lives are not dictated according to their division of responsibilities, a national scheme or a state scheme. These are their lives. It's the job of government to fit in with the cycle of people's lives, not the other way around. We want to look at how we can do this better together. Existing mainstream services and facilities like health and education, transport, they must be more accessible and supportive. We are still having some of the same arguments that we've been having when I first became the Parliamentary Secretary. We need to foster inclusion and not segregation. We need to see investment in community-based programs, sports, rec, education, ensuring these programs are better integrated in the support mix for NDIS participants. It's about doing these things in addition to properly funding the NDIS. Because the NDIS in isolation cannot deliver on the vision of independence, because it was never conceived or promised to support every Australian with any disability. There's that great recurring sentiment across our community is that it takes a village to ensure Australians with disability get to live a fulfilling life that many take for granted. I acknowledge the work of my colleague, the Minister for Social Service, Amanda Rishworth, for driving the work on Australia's disability strategy to help this. And I'm rapt to see the newest Minister for Disability in the nation, Kate Washington, here from New South Wales, and welcome. And I look forward to working with her and the other states and territories for the states to step up. As I've said in many other places, the level of state government cannot have it both ways. They can't retreat from supporting people outside the scheme and, on the other hand, make a diminishing contribution to the NDIS. All levels of government need to honour their commitment to their citizens with disability, to provide them with high-quality, inclusive healthcare, education, justice, housing, transport. It's a joint responsibility. So finally, I want to say to the people with disability across Australia, I understand your sense of urgency, your urgency to make the NDIS work better for participants. Our government will continue to work with the disability community to design and implement improvements that need to be made. Public trust and confidence in the scheme is crucial, and it will be dependent upon our reforms serving the best interests of the participants. The best interests of the participants is our litmus test. We don't want the patchwork reform of our predecessors, which was a bit like the proverbial badly renovated house. Rooms tacked on without rhyme or reason, hallways that lead nowhere, and doors that don't open. It is unacceptable that vulnerable people find this mess almost impossible to navigate and feel sometimes totally abandoned by the scheme. So there is, within the disability community of Australia and the broader Australian people, a desire for substantive systemic reform. But for any reform to work, we need the engagement of the disability movement. I need your experiences of the disability world, your input, your support. Having first met you in 2007, having seen what you're capable of in the campaign for the NDIS and to defend the NDIS, I've got no doubt that we'll succeed. Australians support the NDIS because it is life-changing for people with a disability and their families. It's simply transformative. Our NDIS represents what's best about Australia. That we look after each other and, most importantly, look after those who need extra support. The NDIS sees the whole person, not just the impairment. It seeks to empower all Australians to participate in the life of our country on their terms. We are a lucky country, and we should not exclude anyone from that opportunity because of a disability. This extends beyond the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do for our country, for those with disability and those without disability, for our economy, for the nation we want to see in the mirror. Without the NDIS, the cost to Australians will be far greater than today. It's 10 years now from the very first initial trials in the Barwon and the Hunter regions. Australia's NDIS is embedded as a fundamental government promise on a level with Medicare. Medicare is the idea that the health of any one of us matters to all of us. At the centre of the NDIS is the understanding that disability could affect any one of us or our family. And talking of Australian values, there's no greater embodiment than the disability movement, which is really a shorthand way of me expressing my privilege to stand alongside the advocates of the disability movement and serve the millions of Australians they speak for. If you are an Australian with a disability, let me say this to you. It is core business of Labor to reform and restore the NDIS, to undo the drift of the last decade, ensuring that the NDIS is secure and sustainable. It is the source of world-class, life-changing support, delivering for the next generation of Australians who will have need of it. I can promise every Australian who cares about the future of the NDIS that the size of the challenge in front of us is more than matched by the strength of the Albanese government's determination. And if I can conclude, if you'll let me, on a very personal note. After the bitter disappointment of the 2019 election, I came to the understanding the universe does not grant reruns. But with every precious minute in the job as NDIS Minister, I actually do feel like I have a remarkable second chance to return to where it started, to serve where my passion beats. I've said before, working with disability advocates, people with disability experts, with Julia Gillard and Jenny Mack, and literally thousands of Aussies living with disability, it has been a journey of discovery and of privilege. I know there is nothing I will ever do that is more important than securing the future of the NDIS. I am here because of you, and I am working for you, and together I know that we can create the NDIS which you deserve. Thank you.